This is discussion 16a. It's the only part of the discussion today. I want to talk about medieval Europe and gender, and this is something you're going to want to watch this before you write your discussion assignment, your third discussion assignment. I want to talk about gender roles for just a little bit in Europe. Remember I talked in the lecture today about Augustine and how he had the city of God, city of the world ideal. Well, Augustine also wrote about gender, and in particular he said that men and women were created with different types of souls. That men had more rational souls and women had more sensual souls. And Augustine argued that this actually showed that God wanted a hierarchy. He wanted patriarchy. He wanted men in charge of women because men were rational and women were more sensual. And Augustine claimed that basically Christians should, as part of being a Christian, should try to live in the city of God. And he saw that in particular as being turning away from sexuality. When Augustine, he actually wasn't born a Christian. His mother was Christian, his dad was a pagan. Throughout his young adult life, or his adult life up to his 30s, his mother kept trying to convert him to Christianity. He's like, no. Because he thought of Christianity as being a rejection of all the physical pleasures of the world. And when he sort of had a mental breakdown and then converted to Christianity, but when he was thinking about can he convert to Christianity, he thought of it as a barrier, that if you stay on this side of the barrier, you're in the world, you can have sex, you can drink, you can pursue a career, you can become rich and famous, etc. But if you step across that barrier and become Christian, you have to renounce all of that, including sex. And he actually imagined all the women he had ever slept with standing there saying, can you really give us up? Can you really give us up? And then he embodied continence, which means sexual abstinence, as a woman standing there going, come over here. And so Augustine really saw that to be a good Christian, you had to sort of reject sexuality. That was part of the world that you had to step away from. And so Augustine argued that celibacy was the desired state, and he actually saw marriage as not really a desirable state to be in. It was sort of a necessary evil, as I'll get into in a second. Well, by the Middle Ages, Augustine is hugely influential, and by the Middle Ages, and one thing I want to point out is during the Middle Ages, most of the writers, especially in the early Middle Ages, were churchmen. Right? The church was the only organization that was educating people systematically, so most of the people who were doing any writing were in the church, and they had taken a vow of chastity, or at least in theory had. And so much of the writing in the early Middle Ages it really takes up from Augustine and argues that sex is a fallen state and that people should renounce sex, that celibacy is how you should live. And so what you see emerge in the Middle Ages then is something that historians call the saint-whore dichotomy. And that basically it means that all women are either categorized as being sexual and therefore whores, or celibate and therefore saints. Let me explain what I mean. In the story of Adam and Eve, in Adam and Eve, the serpent, who's the devil, comes into the Garden of Eden and convinces Eve to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which the Lord had told her not to eat. And she eats it and convinces Adam to eat it too, and then they both have knowledge of good and evil, and they realize they're naked. Well, this is a metaphor for sex, right? And so they discover sex, essentially, and they get cast out of the Garden of Eden. And I talked about this in a previous thing. Eve, Augustine argues that Eve's mistake was that she was too sensual. She couldn't resist the temptation of the fruit, and by that he really means of sex. And so women are unable to resist the fruit of temptation or the temptation of sexuality. And so on the one hand you have women like Eve who are sexual, and Augustine argues that they're going to be sexual, and because of that, they're going to tempt men into sex also, and that's sinful. And so marriage now emerges as just a necessary evil. It's the second best state. If you can't control yourself, then at least get married so that you're only having sex with one person. That's not ideal, it's not optimal, but it's the second best, right? But in general, in medieval writing, there's a real sense that women are sexual and they tempt men into sexuality, and women are therefore the playthings of the devil and sin, and that women have to be controlled either through marriage or, well, essentially through marriage is the way to control female sexuality. Then on the other side of that, you have the saints. The Virgin Mary is, of course, the prototypical saint here, but during the Middle Ages you see there are lots of women who are celebrated as saints, but almost every time a woman is celebrated as a saint, the main drama of her sainthood is the temptation of sexuality. She has to overcome her sexuality to become a saint, and if she does, she is virginal, but she's also a saint. So her power comes from overcoming sexuality. Let me give you an example of this from there was a book written in the late 500s by a guy named Gregory of Tours. He was a bishop of the city of Tours, which is in northwestern France. And he is talking about his area in northern France, and he gives two stories, and they're one right after the other. The first one, he talks about a bishop who, at that point people elected their bishops. They weren't appointed by the Pope. And so these people elect this guy bishop. Well, he's already married. And so he decides to be bishop. He has to send his wife away. So he sends her off to a convent. And he becomes celibate in order to become a bishop. But according to Gregory of Tours, in the middle of the night, the wife gets overcome with what he calls the devil's own malice and becomes a second Eve. And she goes through the town and she bangs on the door where the bishop is staying and says, "Let me in and have sex with me. Damn it, I'm your wife." And he tells her to go away, and he tells her to go away, but then he finally lets her in and he has sex with his own wife. And the next day he's so ashamed of it that he renounces sex permanently, and he sends his wife even farther away, and he prays for forgiveness from the Lord for his sin of having sex with his own wife. Right? And so in that story you see a couple things, that the devil works through women to tempt men into sin, that that having sex with his own wife is sinful, it's a fall from grace, and that she is sensual and he's supposed to be the one who knows better and stops it. That's all there. Well, immediately after that, Gregory of Tours tells another story about a different set of people. There's a young couple, and their families have arranged for them to be married. They're a nice aristocratic family. He calls them a senatorial family. They're from a Roman family. This is in the 500s. So there's still families identify as Roman. And they get married, and they get put in the bed to consummate the marriage, and the man's like, "Okay, let's have sex," and the woman is crying. And he's like, "Well, why are you crying? We just got married." And she says, "Because my whole life I had thought that I would save myself for Jesus and be married to him, but now I'm going to be what she calls sullied by having sex with you, and it's going to ruin everything." And the man is so touched by this, he says, "You know what? You're right. Let's both renounce sex, and we won't ever consummate our marriage. We'll just both renounce sex, and we'll both try to be really holy." Right? And Gregory of Tours is clearly saying, I mean, he's setting up the saint-whore dichotomy by having these two stories right here. Women can either be temptresses who tempt men into sex, or they can renounce sex and be holy. Right? And so he's really setting up this either-or saint-whore dichotomy. And really, wives are seen as a whore who has sort of been made a little bit respectable. Right? The church really, the medieval writings again and again have this contempt for women in this sense that women are just temptresses who tempt men into sex and into sin. And so the only good woman is the saint who can completely be celibate and renounce all sex. I bring all this up because I want you to think about, how does this compare to, say, banjiao? And how are the requirements for a woman under Confucianism different than these medieval requirements? But I want you to think about it in particular terms when you're reading the Canterbury Tales. I have you read two parts of the Canterbury Tales. The first is the Man of Law's Tale, and this talks about a woman named Constance. And I want you to ask yourself, where does Constance fit in the saint-whore dichotomy? And how does Constance compare to, say, Banjiao's idea of how a woman should act under Confucianism? Think about that. But then I want you to think, the second story I have you read is the wife of Bath's tale. And so it's a woman, it's her story, and she's telling her own story. And I want you to ask, how does she fit into the saint-whore dichotomy? And how does she fit in compared to Banjiao? And I want you to think about, what does this mean? Because the two stories, and just to give you some idea on the Canterbury Tales, the whole setup of the Canterbury Tales is there's a group of people who are going to Canterbury, which is a city in England. They're going to go worship at the shrine of a saint. And on the way there, to pass the time, these people who don't know each other, they sort of fell in together and realized, oh, you're going to Canterbury, I'm going to Canterbury, let's go together. So they're all traveling together. But to pass the time, one of them organizes a storytelling contest. And so each of them tells a story. And so there's a prologue where each of them sort of talks a little about themselves, and then they tell their story. And so I'm having you read the Man of Law's tale, and I'm having you read the Wife of Bath's tale as two of the people telling their stories. So this is from the same work, but you'll see that Constance and the Wife of Bath are very different. And I want you to be asking yourself, what is the difference here? Is this maybe the saint-whore dichotomy, or is it something else? Because I'm not sure that I'm not sure that both Constance and the Wife of Bath fit this anymore. And the reason I bring all this up is that Chaucer is late in the Middle Ages. He's writing in the late 1300s, right at the end of the High Middle Ages. And I'll talk next time about how much Europe starts changing after the 1300s. And I think Chaucer is giving us a sort of an image of how the saint-whore dichotomy is already breaking down a little bit. But you might think about, how is it breaking down? How does the Wife of Bath fit? How does Constance fit? Is one of them the ideal and one of them the reality? Or is one of them how things used to be and one of them how things are becoming? Or is it something else? Right? They're very different. I want you to think about how they're different. And you can also compare the Canterbury Tales to Ban Zhao's instructions for Chinese women and girls. What would Ban Zhao think of Constance? What would Ban Zhao think of the Wife of Bath? So you can think about all those things as you're reading this, and you can think about that for your third discussion assignment.